So this is my Friday Reads video, and it's Thursday night. I normally film this on the Friday, usually Friday night after I get off of work, but the Agathon starts tomorrow, and when I get home from work, I just want to sit and read some Agatha Christie. So I'm filming this now, and in terms of what I read this past week, I made it through the 2 volumes of John Charles Dent's The Story of the Upper Canadian Rebellion that I showed off in my Friday Reads video last week. It took me about 3 days to get through the 2 volumes. And I mentioned in my video last week that these were both published in 1885 as a set. The first volume deals partly with the rebellion, which began, which was in 1837. But the bulk of the first book deals with events leading up to it. And at first it was difficult to figure out where the author was going. At first I was kind of questioning what the author was doing and how these events were actually relevant to the rebellion in Upper Canada. But then I realized that the author was rather cleverly actually laying the groundwork, explaining to the reader how a rebellion was perhaps necessary in the minds of some people, how that attitude grew. And the author does it quite well, actually. This was 1865, so this would have been before Confederation. Confederation was 1867. And the author seems well acquainted with the Canadian political scene. Most of you watching probably are confused about the terms Upper and Lower Canada. A little bit of context. Upper Canada is approximately modern-day Ontario, which is a province here in Canada. Lower Canada is approximately modern-day Quebec. For a period of time, Upper and Lower Canada were governed separately as separate colonies. For a time they were combined under one government, then their governments were separated again. Then of course you have modern day where Upper and Lower Canada are approximately 2 separate provinces within the larger Confederation of Canada. But these books deal with Upper Canada, specifically with events in Toronto, which at the time was the capital of Upper Canada. So as I said, the author lays the groundwork. One of the key things that he pulls out for the reader is a court case which illustrates just how corrupt and how oligarchic the governance structure in Upper Canada was at the time. This was before responsible government. This was before an actual democracy that could be considered democratic from our contemporary stance. So you had the lieutenant governor, who was essentially the highest power within Upper Canada, and the lieutenant governor was appointed by the bureaucracy in Britain and roughly represented the power of the crown in Canada, in Upper Canada. You had an assembly as well, which would have been sort of the equivalent of the House of Commons nowadays. But the author deals with a court case where a man who was in opposition to the Tories, to the dominant political ideology of the time, a man who was kind of throwing about some ideas of reform. This is a time when there wasn't really an organized opposition in Upper Canada. Long story short, he'd been in Canada for over a year. He published some things. He was brought into court on charges of libel, I believe. And essentially he was prosecuted on the basis that he hadn't been in Canada a year. A couple people lied under oath, and he was ordered deported for saying libelous things on the basis that he hadn't been in Canada for 6 months, and so they could deport him basically for no reason. And he protested. He'd been here over a year, regardless of what people were saying. And so he didn't leave, and so the government had him arrested again, and he was imprisoned, awaiting trial, and he was in jail for 6 months, almost a year. And the treatment nearly drove him crazy. The author recounts his trial. A man who had been outspoken, hardly said anything at all, seemed to be not mentally present, not prepared to defend himself. And eventually he was released on the condition that he leave the country, leave Upper Canada, as per his deportation order. And as the author says, he was never the same man. So you have that story. Someone who was basically ejected from the country and imprisoned because of his political views, which were in opposition. Many, many times people were brought up on libel charges for being in opposition to the government. But when we get to the end of this first volume and the beginning of the second volume, the bulk of the second volume actually, it is really the story of William Lyon Mackenzie, the grandfather of a former Canadian Prime Minister. Well, in his time it would have been a future Prime Minister, but a Canadian Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was Prime Minister in the 1930s. So this was his grandfather. And his grandfather ran a newspaper. He was trying to start a reform movement. So Mackenzie ran for the Assembly in Toronto. And he wasn't allowed to take his seat. He was actually ejected from the House 3 times. Each time he tried to take his seat, the government objected and tried to have him thrown out. On one occasion, they prevented him after his election from taking the oath, and so he went to the lieutenant governor, and after a weekly process, a long process of many weeks, he was able to take his oath, and he took his signed oath, saying that he is in fact a member of that house and that he is entitled to be there, and goes and attempts to take his seat. And immediately the Sergeant-at-Arms tries to throw him out, which sparked a 6-hour debate in the House about whether they should let him take his seat or not. After 6 hours, nothing was resolved, and he was once again thrown out, and he did not try to take his seat again. And this was all because he was a reformist. And at this time you have a new lieutenant governor coming in, and this lieutenant governor is sent to reform. But his advisors, of course, are Tories. His advisors are members of this oligarchy. And it's not long until he's not a reformer anymore. He's not there to reform. He sees it as the monarchy, the British government versus, instead of reformers, versus enemies of the crown who are attempting to make Upper Canada into a republic. Which, as we find out later when the rebellion starts, is partly true. But after having his newspaper printing office ransacked illegally, and no criminal charges laid against the members of the oligarchy who pretty much in broad daylight illegally ransacked his office and ruined his printing equipment, after they basically got off scot-free. I mean, he sued them in a civil court, but nothing criminal happened. After that, and after a series of other events in which he was not reelected, in which reformers felt they were being disenfranchised because voters were being intimidated at the polls and government agents were giving away free land to people who agreed to vote for the government. Mackenzie and a number of other prominent reformers devised a plan. Mackenzie's grand plan was to take Toronto in broad daylight in a bloodless coup. Now, the coup was going to be bloodless because the British military was mostly in Kingston. Kingston is near Quebec, if that makes sense. And so it would have been just on the border of Lower Canada. And the British government was very concerned at the time because they were expecting a rebellion in Lower Canada. So Mackenzie and a few of the other reformers decide that since the British government is preoccupied with Lower Canada, they'll never suspect a coup in Upper Canada. And so they get about 500 volunteers together. They get this plan going. They have people within the government who are willing to support them. And things go wrong. And it's not because the lieutenant governor got word of things too soon. Actually, there's a funny story of the lieutenant governor being awakened in the night as the 500 volunteers are gathering just outside of Toronto, no less than 3 times before he finally believes that Toronto is going to be under attack soon. Someone directly warns him. He says, "No fucking way." He goes back to bed. He hears a bell ringing, thinks it's the same guy, goes back to bed, and then another person wakes him up. And he finally believes that Toronto is about to be under attack. They had planned it for a Thursday, I think. And after they realized that the lieutenant governor was getting wind of things, after they realized that the British army was obviously going to come back from Kingston, and that the civilian reserves were going to be called upon, of course, they would have still had time to act on Monday, and they were going to act on Monday, but then you have things like the volunteers saying, well, you know what, we're kind of tired, we're kind of hungry, we want to rest first, we don't want to attack in the dark. If they had attacked that same night that the lieutenant governor found out, they most likely, the author, John Charles Dent says, they most likely would have taken Toronto. But of course, they didn't. They were a fucking mess, poor organization, poor leadership, and long story short, the rebellion failed, and Mackenzie and a buddy of his ended up crossing Lake Erie in an open boat in late December, which is absolutely fucking crazy. That's a good way to die. And hiding out in Buffalo. From Buffalo, New York, Mackenzie attempted to start an invasion of Canada from Buffalo. He actually got a lot of Americans on his side because a lot of the Americans along the border saw this rebellion as kind of an independence movement, as something to be admired. They saw these rebels as liberators. Which is kind of crazy, considering they weren't very well organized. So, from Buffalo, New York, they get a hold of a boat called the Caroline. And they go up and down the water between Upper Canada and the United States, firing on British troops, firing on Canadian militia. And it's problematic for the Canadians, for the British, because the Caroline is in American waters, but eventually the Canadian militia sneak out in the night and set fire to the Caroline, causing an international incident because the Caroline was in American waters. And according to Mackenzie's story, according to a lot of the information you read online, the Caroline, after being set on fire, was swept over Niagara Falls. The author, John Charles Dent, refutes this, though. He provides in an appendix the first-hand account of the man who claims to be the one who lit the match, or rather, upset the stove that purposely set fire to the Caroline. And he says it sank before it even reached the falls. In addition to that, Dent argues that even if it hadn't sunk, the currents wouldn't have sent it over the Horseshoe Falls. There's no way that would have happened, he said. Rather, if it had gone over the falls, it would have gone over the American Falls, which are significantly less impressive. And he really questions, in, I think, an excellent way, the truth of Mackenzie's side of the story. Mackenzie really built himself up. He suggested that before the rebellion began, 12 leaders got together in Toronto and created a declaration. Now, the declaration was created, but the other leaders involved say, "What the fuck are you talking about, Mackenzie? 12 of us never got together. Who are these 12 people? We never got together and planned this. This event never happened." And there's a lot of things like that John Charles Dent points out. I'd really like to read another historian's account of these events in 1837, just to get another take on them, to see how much is John Charles Dent's opinion and how much is fact. I just realized it's got really dark in here. In addition to those books, I also read Romeo and Juliet this week. I'll save my thoughts on that for my Shake 2 video, which I think I will film tomorrow. And in terms of what I'm reading this week, well, I'm reading Agatha Christie, of course.